So to achieve the top mark on this question, we need to follow the mark scheme. Insight and astute judgment needs to be used throughout. This will come with practice. The key to establish the story confidently in the introduction is good practice. And then narrative methods, analysed in a sophisticated way, will be enough for Band 5. Evaluation is a Band 6 skill. You'll need to do both. Look how often the word evaluation or evaluated is used in the mark scheme. We're looking for several points to be developed and then evaluated. Some of that must refer to structure and voice, and illustration or examples, short embedded quotations that are appropriate throughout. Look at the use of the word integrated. The story and the authorial method should be integrated. You write about both together. Evaluation, according to the AQA mark scheme, is to determine the value of ideas. So you make some examination and judgments by standing back and assessing what Browning or Fitzgerald have done. In order to get 19 to 21 marks, we need to be showing this skill several times in the course of your writing. So here are 3 example paragraphs. The introduction is a tricky skill that students often find difficult. In much longer essays, we would expect you to start with something like a thesis statement and to give an overall appreciation of what it is you're trying to prove or show throughout your essay. But here we are under time pressure and of course the pressure of length, so we're not expecting necessarily an introduction that does that. In my opinion, is the best way to open the narrative question, or the way the author tells the story question, is to begin by clearly identifying an understanding of the story, the plot points. So here, we've actually got a paragraph that achieves very few marks on its own, if any. But what it does is it establishes the story so that the examiner knows exactly that you understand the basics of the story on its very superficial level, i.e. the plot points. Read it now. Porphyria's Lover by Robert Browning tells the story of an unnamed speaker who sits alone on a stormy night awaiting the arrival of his lover of the title. As she walks in, Porphyria lights the fire and becomes physically close with him. He then has an epiphany moment and realizes she is deeply in love with him, and then strangles her with her yellow hair and remains with her corpse until the morning. Here then, in our first body paragraph, we can establish an explicit focus for the first time on the task, which is to identify, discuss, analyse and especially evaluate Browning's use of narratology, or the aspects of narratology. I've started with the point that is probably most pertinent, the fact that his form, the dramatic monologue written in first person but with an implied listener, is absolutely key. I've used some evaluative terms, key, chillingly, distinct, memorable, which are judgments, and they begin to approach the requirements of Band 6. The rest is good and analytical at Band 5, and sets up closer analysis and evaluation to come. Browning's use of the dramatic monologue form is key to the approach he takes in telling this story. The perspective is entirely framed through the voice of the lover, and, given his evidently psychopathic tendencies, he is clearly giving an unreliable account of events. His perspective, however, is characterized by a calm and measured tone, which chillingly disguises the murderous intent, and is reinforced in a number of distinct and memorable ways. Because you only have a maximum of half an hour to answer this question, it's important that you group ideas that are connected in one paragraph. So pathetic fallacy, which is a good place to perhaps start or place quite close to the beginning, should go in with a discussion of setting. These are narrative points. They are ways in which Browning has consciously decided to tell this particular story. And what it allows us to do quite clearly is to evaluate. It's also pretty easy to evaluate setting. Look at this example. There is a powerfully evocative use of pathetic fallacy in the opening of the poem, which establishes a mood and tone of confusion and disorder. The rain sets early in, the sullen wind. This effectively mirrors the narrator's unreliability and sense of instability and unpredictability. It also establishes the setting, a clear contrast between the cold and wet exterior and the coming warmth of Porphyria when she enters and makes the cheerless grate blaze up. The single setting used throughout the poem feels claustrophobic and minimalistic, allowing the insanity of the event to unfold in the foreground. Browning uses the cottage to seem on the surface a potentially romantic setting, but instead he radically subverts this. I would say this paragraph comfortably hits the top of band 6. You'll have a range of ideas about what to write next. You could choose to write about characterization perhaps, or time, or the use of specific punctuation or language devices. But remember, we must stick to the points about narratology, and therefore a discussion on the way the poem sounds, i.e. its meter and its rhythm, is a good choice for most poems. Here in Porphyria's Lover, with a very even, measured tone and meter, there could be a good discussion about the matter-of-fact tone and style of the speaker's voice, which juxtaposes with the murder and the psychopathic tendencies. Here's my example. Another way the tone is effectively maintained is the steady, mostly consistent use of iambic tetrameter, which encourages a reading akin to the sound of a steady heart beating. The poem is written in one long continuous stanza, but the 60 lines are broken into distinct cinquains, which follow a regular, asymmetrical rhyme scheme. Every fifth line stands out as an additional rhyme, breaking with traditional form. This line often sheds significant light on the role of the narrator. For example, the first use of first person, this is in the fifth line, is "I listened with heart fit to break." Here we get a sense of voice and perspective for the first time, and it is deliberately melodramatic and abstract. The lover wants us to feel he is emotionally connected to Porphyria. There's more to say here, and I would expect that in half an hour you could say a little bit more than this example does. This is where the PowerPoint and the video end, but what I would like you to do is I'd like you to think carefully about how to conclude and perhaps any other points that you feel are significant enough to evaluate before finishing.